I'm Buddy, 32 years old, and I've spent my entire life as the invisible son. While my sister Grace basked in my parents' endless adoration, I quietly built a tech company that sold for $15 million. Nobody in my family knew until last Thanksgiving when the truth slipped out during dinner. What followed was the most spectacular meltdown I've ever witnessed, with my sister screaming, my dad choking on his turkey, and decades of family dynamics imploding in minutes. Before I tell you how it all went down, let me know where you're watching from in the comments, and hit that like and subscribe button if you've ever felt like the forgotten child in your family. Growing up in a middle-class suburban neighborhood in Chicago, my childhood looked perfectly normal from the outside. Our house on Maple Street had the requisite white picket fence, a basketball hoop in the driveway, and a golden retriever named Max, who greeted us when we came home from school. My parents, Richard and Carol, were both educators who placed enormous value on academic achievement. Dad taught high school history and coached the debate team, while Mom was an elementary school principal known for her strict standards and high expectations. From my earliest memories, there was an unspoken hierarchy in our home. My sister Grace, 3 years my senior, was the golden child. She possessed natural gifts that aligned perfectly with what my parents valued. Grace could play Mozart on the piano by age 7, won the regional spelling bee 3 years running, and maintained a perfect 4.0 GPA throughout her school years. Her bedroom walls were plastered with certificates, ribbons, and trophies that testified to her excellence. My room, by contrast, contained sports posters and computer parts. Not that anyone in my family ever really saw inside, since they rarely entered my space. Buddy, come see Grace's science fair project. She's made a working model of the solar system. Mom would call up the stairs, her voice brimming with pride. I'd trudge down to see yet another of Grace's accomplishments, being celebrated with cake and photos and congratulatory phone calls to grandparents. When I brought home my first-place trophy from the soccer tournament, Mom glanced at it and said, "That's nice, honey. Put it in your room." Dad didn't even look up from grading papers. That trophy ended up shoved in my closet because there was no point in displaying it when nobody cared. Birthday celebrations highlighted the disparity in our treatment. Grace's birthdays were elaborate affairs with themed decorations, custom cakes, and at least 20 guests. My parents would spend weeks planning the perfect party for her. For my birthdays, Mom would pick up a grocery store cake the day of, and we'd have a quiet family dinner. Some years they'd be so busy with Grace's activities that my birthday would be celebrated days late as an afterthought. "We'll celebrate this weekend, Buddy. Grace has her piano recital today, and you know how important that is," Dad would say, not noticing the disappointment in my eyes. Even in mundane daily routines, the favoritism was apparent. Grace received new clothes at the start of each school year, while I inherited the neighbor boys' hand-me-downs. Her academic achievements were tracked on a special calendar on the refrigerator. My soccer schedule never made it there. When Grace performed in the school play, both parents would take the day off work to attend every performance. But when my soccer team made it to the state championship, Mom said Dad will try to make it if his faculty meeting ends early. He didn't make it. I scored the winning goal with no family there to see it. "Why can't you be more like your sister?" became the soundtrack of my childhood, playing on repeat through elementary and middle school. Mom would sigh this question when I'd rather code on my computer than practice an instrument. Dad would mutter it when my report card showed B's instead of A's. By the time Grace was applying to colleges, our family dynamic was firmly established. The dinner table conversations revolved around her applications to Ivy League schools. My parents hired consultants, essay coaches, and test prep tutors to ensure she presented the perfect application. Harvard or Yale would be ideal, but we'd settle for Princeton, Mom would say, while Dad nodded in agreement. When I mentioned wanting to study computer science, Dad waved his hand dismissively. "Those video games won't get you anywhere in life, Buddy. You should consider a real field like law or medicine, though I'm not sure you have the grades for it." They never noticed that what they called playing around on computers was actually me teaching myself to code, building basic websites for local businesses, and developing a deep understanding of emerging technologies. By 16, I was making more money from my weekend hobby than from my summer job at the local grocery store, but I kept this information to myself. I had learned early that sharing accomplishments led to disappointment when they were minimized or ignored. The pattern continued through high school. Grace was valedictorian, gave a moving speech at graduation, and received a substantial scholarship to Yale. My parents threw her a giant graduation party, inviting practically the entire neighborhood. 2 years later, when I graduated in the top 15% of my class, Mom remembered to take photos, but there was no party. Dad patted me on the shoulder and said, "Not bad, son. Not Grace level, but not bad." That night, as I sat alone in my room looking at college brochures, I made a decision that would shape my future. I would stop seeking approval I would never receive. Instead, I would build my own path on my own terms, without the weight of comparison hanging around my neck. Little did I know how drastically that decision would change everything. My parents' approach to our college educations was as different as our childhood experiences had been. While Grace had received personalized tours of elite universities across the country, intensive SAT prep courses, and an entire home office converted into her application headquarters, my college preparation consisted of a single counselor, meeting at school, and a stack of state university brochures. "We've used most of our college fund for Grace's Yale education," Mom explained when I brought up my own college plans. "Yale isn't cheap, and she might want to go to medical school afterward. You can apply for scholarships and loans like other students do." I ended up at Illinois State University on a partial academic scholarship, working 20 hours weekly at the campus tech support center to cover the rest of my expenses. My dorm room was small and shabby, with cinder block walls and a roommate who played video games until 3 in the morning. But for the first time in my life, I felt free from the constant comparison to Grace. During my freshman orientation, I met Professor Lawrence Jenkins from the computer science department. Balding with wire-rimmed glasses and always wearing some version of the same tweed jacket, he noticed me fixing another student's laptop in the campus center. "That's some impressive troubleshooting," he said, peering over my shoulder. "You clearly know your way around computer systems." In Professor Jenkins, I found something I'd never had before, a mentor who valued my specific talents. He invited me to join his advanced programming seminar, despite my freshman status, and later offered me an independent study opportunity, developing software applications. "You have a natural talent for seeing both the technical details and the big-picture business applications," he told me after I demonstrated my first complete software solution. "That's rare, buddy. Most people excel at one or the other." While my parents rarely called except to share Grace's latest achievements at Yale, I was thriving in my own way. During sophomore year, I developed a scheduling and inventory management system for local businesses that solved specific problems the big software companies were ignoring. 3 restaurants and a hardware store in town paid me to implement my solution, providing me with much-needed income and real-world experience. By junior year, I had created my first moderately successful app, a tool that helped small businesses manage customer relationships without expensive enterprise software. The app generated enough revenue that I could quit my campus job and focus on development. When I called home to share this news, Mom seemed distracted. "That's nice, honey. Did I tell you Grace got engaged? Marcus is a 4th-year medical student at Yale. Their wedding will be next summer after he starts his residency at Massachusetts General Hospital. We're so excited." The engagement dominated our rare family phone calls for months. Marcus came from a wealthy Boston family, and the wedding would be a lavish affair at his parents' Cape Cod estate. My coding success never came up again. Senior year, I faced a decision that would define my future. Several major tech companies had offered me impressive starting positions based on the strength of my portfolio and recommendations from professors. The starting salaries were substantial, especially for a new graduate. But I had a different vision. I wanted to expand my customer relationship software into a comprehensive business solution focusing on security for financial transactions. I believed there was a massive market opportunity that existing companies weren't addressing. When I mentioned turning down the corporate offers to start my own company during a rare visit home, my parents exchanged concerned glances across the dinner table. "Is that really wise?" Dad asked, frowning. Those are guaranteed positions with established companies. Starting a business is risky, and most fail within the first year. Mom reached over to pat my hand. Honey, not everyone can be exceptional like Grace. There's nothing wrong with a steady job with benefits. The corporate world has security that entrepreneurship doesn't. They didn't understand that I wasn't trying to compete with Grace or follow her path. I was creating something entirely different, something that aligned with my own strengths and vision. After graduation, while my family was preoccupied with Grace and Marcus's wedding preparations, I moved to Silicon Valley with my life savings of $12,000 and a prototype of my security software. I rented a tiny studio apartment in a questionable neighborhood and spent every waking hour refining my product and pitching it to potential investors. My parents called occasionally, usually to relay some news about Grace's hospital position or her new house in Boston's exclusive Beacon Hill neighborhood. They never asked detailed questions about my work or life. I kept my responses vague, not out of spite, but because I'd learned long ago that they weren't really interested in the details of my world. "How's California?" Mom would ask. "Fine," I'd reply. "Sunny." "That's nice. Did we tell you Grace and Marcus are thinking about starting a family? I could be a grandmother soon." And so the pattern continued with an entire continent now separating us physically as well as emotionally. But for the first time in my life, I was grateful for the distance and the freedom it gave me to build something of my own without the shadow of comparison dimming my light. The early days of my startup were brutal. I converted my tiny studio apartment into an office, with my mattress shoved against one wall and 3 computer monitors dominating the rest of the space. I worked 100-hour weeks subsisting on ramen noodles and coffee coding until my vision blurred and my fingers cramped. My company, Secure Transact, focused on developing enhanced security protocols for financial institutions that were struggling with increasing online fraud. I had identified a significant gap in the market. Existing security software was either too cumbersome for everyday users or too simplistic to stop sophisticated hackers. The first year was a constant hustle. I attended every tech meetup, startup, pitch night, and networking event in Silicon Valley. I cold-called banks and credit unions begging for 10 minutes of their time. Most doors remained closed, but gradually, through persistence and the strength of my prototype, I secured meetings with decision-makers. My first real team formed organically. Alicia, a brilliant security expert who had grown frustrated with her corporate job's bureaucracy, joined after seeing my presentation at a cybersecurity conference. Then came Ryan, a front-end developer who could make complex security features user-friendly, and Jasmine, who handled business operations with remarkable efficiency. We worked out of a converted warehouse space in Oakland because San Francisco proper was beyond our budget. The building had questionable heating and cooling, occasional roof leaks, and neighbors that included a metal fabrication shop and an artisanal pickle company. But it was our space, and within those walls we were building something revolutionary. Just as we started gaining traction with smaller banks, disaster struck. CyberShield, a major competitor backed by venture capital, announced a security suite with features suspiciously similar to our proprietary algorithms. A week later, we discovered one of our early contract developers had stolen our code and sold it to them. The legal battle nearly destroyed us before we'd truly begun. Legal fees drained our minimal capital, and the stress was overwhelming. For 3 months, I slept on a cot in our office, showering at a nearby gym, working around the clock to keep the company afloat while simultaneously fighting the lawsuit. During this time, Grace called to share the news that she and Marcus had purchased a 5-bedroom colonial in an exclusive Boston suburb. Mom and Dad helped with the down payment, of course. They're so supportive. "How's your computer thing going?" I didn't mention the lawsuit or that I was living in my office. "It's coming along," was all I said. The turning point came unexpectedly. The legal battle had garnered some industry attention, and a senior vice president from First Western Bank reached out. He had reviewed our security protocols and was impressed by our innovative approach. "We've been following your case," he said during our meeting. "What CyberShield did was unethical, and their implementation of your ideas is flawed. We'd like to work with the original inventors, not the copycats." First Western became our first major client, implementing our security system across their digital banking platform. The successful deployment led to case studies, industry articles, and most importantly, more clients. Within 6 months, we had contracts with 8 regional banks and were negotiating with 2 national institutions. Our team grew from 5 people to 50, then to over 200 as demand increased. We moved from the leaky warehouse to proper offices in San Francisco's financial district. I finally upgraded from my studio apartment to a modest 1-bedroom condo, though I spent little time there as the business consumed most of my waking hours. As Secure Transact's reputation grew, so did interest from larger tech companies looking to acquire our technology. The first offer came 3 years after I founded the company, $7 million from a mid-sized financial software provider. I declined, knowing our trajectory and the value we were creating. A year later, the offers had doubled. Investment bankers began calling regularly, suggesting it was time to realize the value we had created. But I remained focused on building and improving our product rather than cashing out. Finally, 5 years after starting with nothing but a prototype and determination, I received an offer that made sense. Tech giant, one of the world's largest technology companies, offered $15 million for Secure Transact. They wanted our technology, our client relationships, and our team. Most importantly, they shared our vision for security and would provide resources to scale our solutions globally. After extensive discussions with my team and advisors, I accepted the offer. At 31 years old, I became a multimillionaire overnight. Throughout this journey, my family remained largely unaware of my professional success. During our infrequent calls, they continued to focus on Grace's achievements: her promotion to head of cardiology, the vacation home she and Marcus purchased in Vermont, the private preschool their children attended. When Mom mentioned that they had helped Grace and Marcus with a kitchen renovation in their main house, I felt a momentary urge to tell them about the acquisition. Instead, I listened to the detailed description of Grace's new marble countertops and Viking range. I continued living modestly despite my new wealth. I upgraded to a comfortable but not extravagant condo, invested most of the money with the help of a fiduciary financial advisor, and donated to educational programs supporting young people interested in technology. The only luxury I allowed myself was occasional travel to places I'd always wanted to visit. My parents still introduced me to their friends as our son, who works with computers in California, while Grace remained our brilliant daughter, the cardiologist. I had made peace with this dynamic and built a fulfilling life, filled with friends who valued me and professional colleagues who respected my contributions. Then came the invitation to Thanksgiving at Grace and Marcus's home in Boston, setting in motion events that would finally shatter the family narrative that had defined us for decades. The invitation arrived via email in early October, formal and impersonal, clearly sent to multiple recipients at once. Grace and Marcus Whittington request the pleasure of your company for Thanksgiving dinner, followed by the date, time, and their address in Wellesley, Massachusetts. My parents were copied on the email, along with Marcus's family members and several couples I didn't recognize, presumably friends of Grace and Marcus. My immediate instinct was to decline. I had spent the previous 3 Thanksgivings with friends in California, enjoying relaxed gatherings free from the tension and comparison that characterized family holidays. But something made me hesitate before hitting reply. Perhaps it was curiosity about how my family dynamic might have evolved over the years, or maybe some lingering hope for connection that I couldn't quite extinguish. Before I could decide, my phone rang. It was Grace. "Did you get my email?" she asked without preamble. "Mom and Dad are coming in on Tuesday, but I told them you probably wouldn't make it since you never seem to have time for family." Her words carried the familiar sting of accusation, implying once again that any distance in our relationship was entirely my fault. Actually, I heard myself saying, "I can make it this year." There was a brief silence. "Oh, well, that's unexpected. Can you arrive Wednesday? The guest room on the 3rd floor will be yours. Mom and Dad get the main guest suite, of course." In the weeks leading up to Thanksgiving, Grace called repeatedly with instructions and reminders that positioned me as incompetent and her as the responsible one managing everything. "Remember to book your flight soon before prices go up," she said. In one call, though, I had booked it immediately after confirming. "Don't bring wine." Marcus has selected appropriate pairings from his collection, she instructed in another, though I hadn't mentioned bringing anything. We're dressing for dinner on Thanksgiving. Business casual at minimum, she informed me, her tone suggesting she expected me to show up in rags otherwise. My parents called too, their message clear, though less direct than Grace's. We're so looking forward to having everyone together, Mom said warmly before adding, Grace has put so much effort into planning this, so please be on your best behavior. No controversial topics and try to show interest in what everyone is doing. Dad chimed in from the extension. And maybe get a haircut before you come. First impressions with Marcus's family matter. I hadn't seen them in nearly 2 years yet. Their primary concern seemed to be how I might embarrass them in front of Grace's in-laws. As the trip approached, my anxiety increased. I scheduled an extra session with Dr. Thompson, the therapist I had been seeing since the tech giant acquisition. The sudden wealth had brought up complicated emotions and identity questions that I was still processing. How do you want to handle the family dynamic this time, she asked during our session, her calm voice centering me as always. I considered the question carefully. I'm tired of playing the role they've assigned me. The underachieving son, the family disappointment. I don't want to pretend anymore. Does that mean you'll tell them about your financial success? No, I said after a moment. That feels like seeking validation through money, which isn't healthy. But I also won't diminish myself or my work to fit their narrative. I'll just be authentic and set boundaries when needed. That's significant progress, buddy, she noted with an approving nod. When I arrived at Boston's Logan Airport the day before Thanksgiving, the weather matched my mood: gray, chilly, and threatening rain. I took a rideshare to Grace and Marcus's address, watching as the neighborhoods became progressively more affluent during the 30-minute drive. Their house was exactly what I expected. A sprawling colonial revival with perfect landscaping, a circular driveway, and a 3-car garage. It looked like it belonged in a luxury real estate magazine, beautiful but somewhat sterile. Grace answered the door herself, perfectly coiffed in designer casual wear pearl earrings catching the light as she gave me a quick perfunctory hug. You made it. Everyone's in the living room, she said already, turning away and leading me through the immaculate foyer. I noted she didn't offer to help with my luggage. The reunion with my parents was a study in awkward formality. Mom rose from an antique settee to embrace me, commenting immediately on my hair, which I had not cut, and how thin I looked. Dad gave me a firm handshake and a pat on the shoulder, his standard greeting. Marcus played the gracious host, offering drinks and making small talk about my flight, while his parents, Gerald and Eleanor, observed with polite interest. They were Boston aristocracy, personified with the kind of old money that never needs to announce itself. And what is it you do in California, Buddy? Eleanor asked during a lull in conversation, her voice carrying the distinctive Boston Brahmin accent. Before I could answer, Grace jumped in. Buddy works in computers, some kind of programming thing, right? She glanced at me with raised eyebrows. I founded a cybersecurity company specializing in financial transaction protection, I replied evenly. It was recently acquired by tech giant. How interesting, Eleanor murmured, clearly not finding it interesting at all. The conversation quickly shifted to Grace's children and their private school accomplishments. The house tour followed, with Grace narrating like a museum docent. This is the formal dining room with the chandelier we imported from Italy. The table seats 20 when fully extended. Each room came with a similar inventory of designer names, imported materials, and subtle price signifiers. When we reached the guest rooms, the hierarchy was clear. My parents were shown to a spacious suite on the second floor, complete with sitting area and private bath. My room was a converted attic space on the third floor, small but functional, with a bathroom down the hall. It's usually the nanny's room, but she's away for the holiday weekend, Grace explained, not quite meeting my eyes. That evening we gathered for a catered pre-Thanksgiving dinner. The conversation revolved primarily around Grace's practice, Marcus's hospital politics, and their children's achievements. When I mentioned a recent trip to Japan, Grace cut in. Buddy, your sweater has a stain, she said, ignoring my travel story entirely. Why don't you borrow one of Marcus's? You're about the same size, though he's more athletic build, of course. Mom nodded in agreement. That would be nice of Marcus. You should look presentable for tomorrow when everyone's here. I glanced down at my perfectly clean cashmere sweater, then back at my sister. "There's no stain, Grace, and I brought appropriate clothes for tomorrow, but thank you for your concern." A brief flash of annoyance crossed her face before she smiled tightly and turned to Marcus's father to discuss golf clubs. As I prepared for bed that night, listening to the murmur of voices from the second floor where my parents were presumably still chatting with Grace and Marcus, I reflected on how little had changed. Despite the physical distance and years apart, we had seamlessly resumed our familiar family script. The only difference was that I was no longer willing to play my assigned role without question. Tomorrow would be Thanksgiving, and I had a feeling our family dynamic was about to face its greatest test yet. Thanksgiving Day dawned clear and cold sunlight, streaming through the small dormer windows of my third-floor room. I could hear activity downstairs, the caterers arriving, Grace issuing instructions in her authoritative voice, the occasional sound of children laughing. I took my time getting ready, mentally preparing for the day ahead. By 10 o'clock, the house was transformed into a Thanksgiving spectacle. Every surface featured seasonal decorations that somehow managed to be both festive and elegantly understated. The dining room table was a masterpiece of design with hand-calligraphed place cards, multiple crystal glasses at each setting, and an elaborate centerpiece of autumn flowers and artfully arranged gourds. Grace was everywhere at once, supervising the caterers, adjusting decorations, and orchestrating family members like pieces on a chessboard. "Mom, please help Eliza with her dress." Dad entertained Marcus's parents in the study. "Buddy, just try not to get in the way." I found myself assigned to child-wrangling duty, keeping Grace's 7-year-old twins Eliza and Ethan occupied while the adults prepared. This suited me fine, as the children were the only family members who seemed genuinely happy to see me. "Uncle Buddy, do you still make computers?" Ethan asked as we built an elaborate structure with his building blocks. "Something like that," I replied, smiling at his simplified understanding of my career. "Mom says you're not very good at it because you still have to work," Eliza informed me matter-of-factly, placing a triangle block on our tower. "She says, if you were successful, you'd have people working for you instead." I managed to keep my expression neutral. "Is that so? Well, people measure success in different ways." As noon approached, additional guests began arriving: Marcus's brother and his wife, two couples who were colleagues from the hospital, and Marcus's elderly grandmother, who was wheeled in by a private nurse. Grace insisted on formal pre-dinner photos in front of the fireplace, arranging everyone in what she deemed appropriate groupings. "Buddy, stand at the end here." She directed, positioning me at the far edge of the family group, partially hidden behind Marcus's brother. When the photographer Grace had hired suggested I move forward to be more visible, she overruled him. "No, the composition is better this way. Trust me." By the time we were called to dinner at 3 o'clock, the tension in my shoulders had formed a persistent knot. We processed into the dining room in what felt like a predetermined order of importance, with Grace and Marcus leading, followed by both sets of parents, then the other guests, with me bringing up the rear. The seating arrangement continued the theme. Grace and Marcus presided at opposite ends of the long table. My parents were placed in positions of honor near Grace, while I found myself between Marcus's grandmother, who was hard of hearing, and one of the hospital colleagues who had already had several glasses of wine. Before the meal began, Marcus stood to propose a toast to family, friends, and the abundance we're blessed to share. Everyone raised their glasses appreciatively. Then, following what was apparently a Whittington family tradition, each person was expected to share something they were grateful for before eating. Grace went first naturally. What began as a simple expression of gratitude evolved into an extended highlight reel of her accomplishments for the year. "I'm thankful for my thriving practice, my recent appointment to the hospital board, the children's acceptance into the gifted program, and of course our new summer home on Nantucket." My parents beamed with pride throughout her recitation. When Mom's turn came, she primarily expressed gratitude for Grace and her family, with a brief general mention of both my children, almost as an afterthought. The ritual continued around the table until it reached me. All eyes turned in my direction, most with the look of polite disinterest reserved for obligatory social interactions. "I'm grateful for the journey of the past few years," I said simply, "for lessons learned, challenges overcome, and the freedom to create my own path." Grace gave a tight smile. "How nice. very philosophical. Then she signaled to the caterers to begin serving. The meal itself was flawless, course after course of gourmet interpretations of traditional Thanksgiving dishes. Wine flowed freely, and conversation moved between safe topics. Politics was avoided, but hospital gossip, private school, comparisons, and vacation properties were discussed in detail. During the main course, Marcus began describing a major hospital acquisition his department was considering. The technology would revolutionize our cardiac imaging capabilities, he explained enthusiastically. The company's valuation is through the roof after their security division was acquired by tech giant last year. I paused mid-bite, recognizing the company immediately as the one that had purchased my security software. Marcus continued, unaware of my reaction. The acquisition was one of the biggest in the financial security sector. Apparently, the founder was some young programming prodigy who developed an entirely new approach to transaction protection. What was the security company called? Asked Gerald Marcus's father, who had investments in the tech sector. Secure Transact, Marcus replied. Relatively unknown until tech giant paid $15 million for their technology and team. The wine glass slipped from Grace's hand, splashing red wine across the immaculate tablecloth. She barely noticed, her wide eyes fixed on me as connections visibly formed in her mind. Secure Transact, she repeated slowly. Buddy, isn't that? The table fell silent, all eyes shifting between Grace and me. I took a sip of water, oddly calm despite the sudden tension. Yes, I confirmed. That was my company. Marcus stared at me, his expression morphing from confusion to dawning comprehension. Wait, you're that Buddy Mitchell, the founder of Secure Transact. The $15 million acquisition was your company. My parents looked completely lost. Dad's fork remained suspended halfway to his mouth, a piece of turkey trembling slightly as his hand froze in place. I had no idea you were behind. That Marcus continued, genuine admiration entering his voice for the first time. The security protocols your team developed are considered revolutionary in the industry. Grace's face had drained of color. $15 million. You sold your company for $15 million. Her voice rose sharply on the final words. Mom found her voice at last. Buddy, what is everyone talking about? What company? The cybersecurity company I founded 5 years ago, I explained calmly. I developed a new approach to protecting financial transactions online. Tech giant acquired it last year. For $15 million, Dad finally managed to ask, his voice barely above a whisper. Yes, I confirmed, meeting his stunned gaze directly. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the soft clink of Marcus's grandmother's spoon against her plate, as she continued eating, blissfully unaware of the dramatic revelation unfolding around her. Grace was the first to break the silence, her voice tight and controlled despite the visible tremor in her hands. This is a joke, right? Some kind of twisted prank you're playing. I shook my head. No joke. Secure Transact was my company. I founded it after college, built it for 5 years, and sold it to tech giant last year. But that's impossible, she insisted, looking around the table as if seeking allies. Buddy works at some little tech support job or something. He's not. He couldn't possibly. Marcus leaned forward, genuine interest animating his features. The Secure Transact acquisition was major news in business circles. Their security protocol completely revolutionized how financial institutions handle online transactions. He turned to me with new respect. I had no idea that was your work. My mother's expression fluctuated between confusion and disbelief. But honey, why didn't you tell us? We're your family. Before I could answer, Grace's voice rose an octave. $15 million. $15 million. And you never said a word, while we've been feeling sorry for you all these years. No one asked, I replied simply. When we talked, which wasn't often, the conversation always centered around your accomplishments. There never seemed to be much interest in the details of my life. Grace pushed back from the table so forcefully that water glasses wobbled. That is completely unfair. We always asked how you were doing. You asked if I was still doing that computer thing. I corrected her. That's not the same as showing genuine interest. Dad finally found his voice. though it emerged as a strained croak. "Son, 15 million island. That's. Why would you keep that from us?" Grace wasn't waiting for my answer. Her initial shock was rapidly transforming into indignation. "This is so typical. You always had to make everything about you, always playing the victim." The irony of her statement was so profound that I actually laughed, which only inflamed her further. "You think this is funny? You've been lying to us for years, making us think you were struggling while secretly being a millionaire. Do you have any idea how that makes us look?" "How it makes you look," I repeated incredulously. "That's your concern right now." Grace was pacing now, her carefully planned dinner completely forgotten. "I can't believe this. All this time we've been worried about you thinking you couldn't afford nice things, offering to help you." "When did you ever offer to help me?" I interrupted, genuinely curious. "Well, we would have if we'd known you needed it," she sputtered. "But apparently you were just playing poor while secretly being rich. What kind of person does that?" Marcus's parents exchanged uncomfortable glances. The hospital colleagues suddenly became very interested in their dessert plates. The private nurse quietly wheeled Marcus's grandmother from the room, sensing the family drama was escalating beyond polite dinner conversation. I never played anything I said, keeping my voice level. I lived modestly because that's what I prefer. And I never told you about the acquisition because money has never been the measure of success in this family. Academic prestige, professional titles, those were what mattered. "That's ridiculous," Mom interjected. "We've always been proud of both our children equally." The statement was so divorced from reality that I couldn't let it pass. "Mom, that's simply not true. My entire childhood was spent in Grace's shadow. My achievements were barely acknowledged, while hers were celebrated extravagantly." "That is not true," Grace shouted, slamming her hand on the table. "You were always the favorite. Mom and Dad bent over backward for you." Dad started to speak, then began coughing violently, reaching for his water glass with a shaking hand. The confrontation had literally taken his breath away. "Favorite," I repeated in disbelief. "Grace, you had elaborate birthday parties while mine were afterthoughts. Your academic achievements were displayed prominently while my sports trophies were shoved in a closet. They attended every one of your recitals but missed my state championship soccer game." "That's because my activities were important," Grace shot back. "Academic and cultural pursuits matter for future success. Kicking a ball around a field doesn't—" "And yet, here we are," I replied quietly. Grace's face flushed deep red. "You know what I'm going to prove how wrong you are." She stormed out of the dining room, leaving everyone in uncomfortable silence. Mom attempted damage control. "Buddy, I think you're remembering things through a very negative lens. We always treated you and Grace exactly the same." "Did you help me with a down payment on a house?" I asked. Mom fidgeted with her napkin. "Well, no, but you never asked. Did you ever offer?" She had no answer for that. Grace returned, clutching several photo albums, her expression triumphant. "Let's see what the evidence says, shall we?" She began flipping through pages aggressively. "Look, here's your 10th birthday party with that ridiculous dinosaur cake Mom made from scratch. Does that look like an afterthought to you?" I leaned forward to see the photo she was pointing to. In the image, 10-year-old me stood awkwardly beside a homemade cake, while Grace, 13, dominated the foreground, clearly annoyed at not being the center of attention. "Grace, that's your dinosaur phase. That was your cake. My birthday was the following week, and I got a grocery store cake that said, 'Happy Birthday,' with no name, because it was a last-minute purchase." She flipped to another page. "Well, what about this, Dad taking you fishing, just the two of you? I never got special trips like that." Dad had regained his composure enough to interject. "Grace, that was the one time I took him fishing, and only because you and your mother were at your piano competition in Springfield." As Grace continued flipping through the albums, a pattern emerged that was visible to everyone at the table. Photo after photo showed family events centered around Grace's achievements with me, often literally in the background or margin of the frame. Holiday photos featured Grace opening multiple presents while I had one or two. Vacation photos showed Grace in the foreground at tourist attractions while I stood apart. The photographic evidence was doing the opposite of what Grace intended, providing visual confirmation of the family dynamic I had described. Marcus placed a gentle hand on Grace's arm. "Honey, maybe we should take a break and—" She shook him off. "No, I will not be painted as some spoiled princess when I worked incredibly hard for everything I achieved." She turned to me, eyes blazing. "Why didn't you tell us about the money? Were you planning to just hoard it all to yourself while letting Mom and Dad help me with expenses all these years?" And there it was, the real issue behind her anger. "I never asked them to prioritize your needs over mine," I replied calmly. "That was their choice, and I never needed their financial support because I built something successful on my own without family connections or support." Grace's voice became dangerously quiet. "So this is revenge, making us all look foolish because you had some childhood grievances." "It's not revenge, Grace. I just stopped seeking approval I was never going to get and focused on building my own life." Dad cleared his throat. "Son, I think you're being a bit unfair. We always supported your interests." When I challenged him directly, "When did you ever show real interest or support for my work? You dismissed my early coding as playing video games. You called my decision to start a company risky and suggested I get a real job instead. You've never once asked me to explain what my company actually did or why it mattered." Dad opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again, unable to provide a counterexample. Grace wasn't ready to concede. "This is absurd. You're rewriting our entire family history because you have some weird inferiority complex, just because you got lucky with some tech thing." "It wasn't luck," Marcus interrupted, surprising everyone. "I've read about secure transacts technology. It was genuinely innovative, revolutionary even." He turned to me with professional respect. "The security protocols you developed solved problems that had plagued the industry for years." Grace shot her husband a betrayed look. "Whose side are you on?" "I'm not taking sides," he replied carefully. "I'm just stating facts about Buddy's professional accomplishments." The tension in the room was becoming unbearable. Mom was quietly crying. Dad looked shell-shocked, and Grace was practically vibrating with a combination of anger and embarrassment. "Why are you doing this?" she demanded, her voice breaking slightly. "Why ruin Thanksgiving with all this ancient history and resentment?" "I didn't bring it up," I reminded her gently. "I've kept my success private precisely to avoid this kind of reaction." Marcus recognized my company's name by coincidence. "So you were never going to tell us?" Mom asked, hurt evident in her voice. "Your own family?" I looked at her directly. "Would it have changed anything? Would knowing I had financial success suddenly make my path valid in your eyes? Because that's not how unconditional support is supposed to work." The silence that followed was profound. For perhaps the first time, my parents and sister were truly seeing me not as the perpetual disappointment they had categorized me as, but as an adult who had carved his own successful path despite not because of his family background. Grace abruptly stood, tears streaming down her face. "I need some air." She walked out of the dining room, leaving behind the wreckage of her perfect Thanksgiving dinner. The remaining guests exchanged uncomfortable glances. Marcus's brother murmured something about checking on their car, and he and his wife made a discreet exit. The hospital colleagues followed shortly after, thanking Marcus with forced cheerfulness, as if they hadn't just witnessed an explosive family meltdown. In the sudden quiet of the nearly empty dining room, Dad attempted a weak justification. "We always wanted what was best for both of you. Maybe we didn't always get it right." It was the closest thing to an admission I had ever heard from him, and despite everything, I felt a small spark of hope that perhaps finally something might change in our family dynamic. The remainder of Thanksgiving evening passed in a blur of awkward silences and stilted attempts at normal conversation. Grace eventually returned to the dining room, eyes red but composure, regained and mechanically served dessert, as if following a script she couldn't abandon. The few guests who hadn't found excuses to leave ate pumpkin pie with forced enthusiasm, complimenting the catering while studiously avoiding any reference to the emotional explosion they had witnessed. As the evening wore on, I made the decision to leave rather than stay overnight as planned. The third-floor guest room suddenly felt like a perfect metaphor for my position in the family, an afterthought separate from the main household. "I think it's best if I get a hotel room tonight," I announced quietly, as the last guests were preparing to leave. Mom looked distressed. "Buddy, that's not necessary. We're family. We can work through this." "I know we can," I agreed, "but not tonight. Everyone needs some space to process." As I packed my overnight bag, Grace appeared in the doorway of the guest room. Her perfect hostess demeanor had crumbled, replaced by a conflicted expression I couldn't quite read. "You're leaving," she stated flatly. "Yes. I've called a car service." She leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed defensively. "So that's it? Drop a bomb on the entire family, and then just leave?" "I didn't drop any bomb, Grace. Marcus recognized my company's name. That's all." She was quiet for a moment, then asked the question that was really on her mind. $15 million. That's really true?" "Yes. And you're just sitting on all that money while Mom and Dad help us with the kids' private school tuition and our house renovation." Even now, she was viewing my success primarily in terms of how it could benefit her. Some patterns run too deep to break in a single evening. My financial decisions are my own, Grace, just as Mom and Dad's decisions about supporting you are theirs. She stepped into the room, then lowering her voice. "We're planning to add a pool house next summer. Marcus's practice is doing well, but with the kids' tuition and the Nantucket property taxes." I stared at her in disbelief. "Are you actually asking me for money right now? After everything that just happened?" She had the grace to look momentarily embarrassed before recovering. "We're family, buddy. Family helps each other. At least most families do." I zipped my bag closed with finality. "Good night, Grace. Thank you for dinner." As I headed downstairs, Marcus intercepted me in the foyer away from the others. "I owe you an apology," he said quietly. "I've always accepted the family narrative about you without question. That was wrong of me." His sincerity surprised me. "Thank you for saying that. For what it's worth, what you built with Secure Transact was extraordinary. The medical technology company that licensed your security protocols has transformed our cardiac care capabilities." For the first time that evening, I felt truly seen for my professional accomplishments, ironically by my brother-in-law rather than my own parents. "That means a lot, Marcus. Thank you." My rideshare arrived, saving us from further conversation, and I stepped out into the cold November night, exhaling a breath I felt I'd been holding for years. In my hotel room that night, I sat by the window overlooking Boston's twinkling skyline, processing the events of the day. My phone buzzed repeatedly with texts from Grace, alternating between apologies and thinly veiled financial requests. "I'm sorry things got heated. Family dynamics are complicated. Have you considered setting up college funds for your niece and nephew? I didn't mean what I said about you playing the victim. Our contractor mentioned the pool house would be a perfect tax write-off for someone in your position." I silenced the phone and tried to sleep, but rest eluded me as conversations from the evening replayed in my mind. The next morning, just after 7, my phone rang. It was Dad. "Can we meet for coffee?" he asked, his voice subdued. "Just you and me." We arranged to meet at a cafe near my hotel. When I arrived, Dad was already there, looking older and more vulnerable than I had ever seen him. Without the protective presence of Mom and Grace, something in his demeanor had shifted. "I didn't sleep last night," he admitted after we had ordered. "Kept thinking about things you said. Things I couldn't really argue with." I waited silently, giving him space to continue. "I always thought we were good parents," he said, staring into his coffee cup. "Thought we gave both our children what they needed. But looking at those photo albums last night, seeing it all laid out like that," his voice cracked slightly, "we really did put Grace at the center of everything, didn't we?" It was the first genuine acknowledgement I had ever received from him about our family dynamic. "Why?" I asked simply. "Why was there such a difference in how you treated us?" Dad was quiet for a long moment. "Grace was like us," he finally said. "She followed the path we understood. Academic achievement, prestigious credentials, a professional career. When she succeeded, it validated our own life choices and values." He looked up at me, then really looked at me. "But you were different from the beginning. Creative, independent, interested in technology we didn't understand. Your path didn't fit our narrow definition of success, so I guess we just didn't know how to support it." You could have tried, I said quietly. You could have asked questions, shown interest, attended my games. You're right, he admitted, tears forming in his eyes. And I can't go back and change that, but I am proud of what you've built, son. Not because of the money, but because you had the courage to follow your own path even when we didn't understand it. My phone rang, interrupting the moment. It was Mom asking where Dad had gone so early. When I explained we were having coffee, she insisted on joining us. Within 30 minutes, she arrived at the cafe, breathless and defensive. Richard has been telling me about your conversation, she began without preamble. And I think you're being very unfair. We always loved both our children equally. Love isn't the issue, Mom, I replied gently. It's about recognition, support, and validation. It's about showing up for soccer games, not just piano recitals. We were busy working parents doing our best, she insisted. If we focused more attention on Grace, sometimes it was because she needed more guidance. Dad surprised me by intervening. Carol, that's not entirely true, and you know it. We prioritized Grace because her achievements made us look good as parents. We understood her path. Buddies was foreign to us, so we minimized it. Mom's eyes widened at Dad's candor. For perhaps the first time in their marriage, he was contradicting her version of our family narrative. The conversation that followed was difficult, emotional, and long overdue. Mom initially remained defensive, but as Dad continued acknowledging specific instances of favoritism, her certainty began to crack. I never realized how it must have looked through your eyes, she finally admitted. We didn't mean to make you feel less important. Impact matters more than intent, I replied, a phrase Dr. Thompson had often used in our sessions. By the time we parted that afternoon, something fundamental had shifted. No single conversation could heal decades of imbalance, but acknowledgement was a crucial first step. 3 months later, the changes in our family dynamic were subtle but significant. My parents called more frequently, asking specific questions about my work and life. Dad had even taken an online course about cybersecurity to better understand my field. Grace struggled the most with our new reality. Her identity had been built around being the family star, and adjusting to a more equal relationship proved challenging. Her financial hints continued occasionally, but with decreasing frequency, as she realized I wasn't going to be her personal banker. For my part, I established clearer boundaries while remaining open to a healthier family connection. I used a portion of my wealth to establish a scholarship fund for overlooked students with aptitude in technology, trying to create the support system I had lacked. One Tuesday afternoon, I met with the first recipient of the scholarship, a brilliant 16-year-old named Jamal, who reminded me powerfully of my younger self. As he excitedly described his plans for developing accessible technology for disabled users, I saw in him the same passion and vision that had driven me. My parents want me to be a doctor, he confided. They don't really get what I'm trying to build. Keep building anyway, I told him. Sometimes the people closest to us are the last to recognize our true path. That doesn't make the path any less valid. The real measure of success, I had learned, wasn't financial achievement or family validation, but the freedom to define and pursue your own purpose. Money hadn't healed my family wounds, but honesty and boundaries had begun the process. As I watched Jamal leave brimming with ideas and potential, I felt a sense of peace that had eluded me for decades. The overlooked son had finally found his voice, not through revenge or resentment, but through creating something meaningful from the very qualities his family had failed to value. If you've ever felt invisible in your own family or had your achievements overlooked while others were celebrated, share your story in the comments below. How did you find your own path to validation and success? Sometimes the greatest revenge isn't proving others wrong, but finding happiness on your own terms. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video if it resonated with you. Remember, the approval that matters most is the kind you give yourself. Thank you for listening to my story, and I wish you the courage to follow your own path, even when those around you don't understand it.